Thank you so much. So this is the first time that I've done one of these Zoom meetings in a while, so you'll have to bear with me as I remember to work these little bits and pieces out. I saw somebody post just in the Q&A earlier, or in the chat earlier, mentioned that they did not know that there was a women's land army in America during World War I, and there was. And the more I've learned about these women, the more fascinated I have become by them. They are kind of a unique group of women. So I'm kind of going to give you a broad overview of why they began, why the Women's Land Army exists in World War I, how it exists, and just snippets here and there of its existence, at least in the Mid-Atlantic. There are much larger organizations all across the country, places like California, New Mexico, New York, but I kind of like a challenge, and so I've been looking a little bit more at places like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and Washington D.C. too. So without further ado, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see how this goes. Oh, perfect. Okay. Yes, that is what I want to share. Okay. So let's. Oh, delightful. There we go. Okay, so slideshow. Amazing. Okay. So I'm sorry, I just realized I forgot to change the title of this. This is not the DAR Museums. That was a live one just a couple weeks ago, which I was really excited to get back into this research. This is the DAR Museum, so I apologize for that. But so let's talk about, we are familiar, it was mentioned earlier, we're familiar with the gardening efforts of World War II, but many of us are unaware of the efforts during World War I, these gardening, these production efforts in World War I. And even before American military involvement in World War I, the federal government and a broad array of private organizations began or promoted a variety of national programs relating to home economics, gardening, large-scale agriculture. This is something that we've seen in the early 20th century, this progressive movement, the home economics, canning, food conservation, but it really begins to ramp up again starting around 1910 and moving forward. When war does break out in 1914 in Europe, of course, there's a promotion then of patriotism and service to your country through food production and conservation, and this was an urgent need. However, in February of 1917, on February 20th, 1917, there were food riots that began in New York City. On February 22nd, 1917, the Winchester Evening Star had a headline that said, "Threatened food famine more serious than war menace." The article noted the food supply in the United States was below the danger mark and that prices were higher than at any other time before the Civil War. As these riots began to spread across the nation, to Philadelphia, to Cincinnati, to Chicago, these riots, looting is very common. Police struggle to maintain order in these cities. Newspaper article described mobs of, quote, foreign women, end quote, who raided stores, broke windows, stole milk from doorsteps, and they attacked other women who were seeking to buy food. On the 24th of February, the newspaper claimed that there was a fear that these riots would spread into the nation's capital. So how do we get food riots in the United States in 1917? There are a lot of reasons for this. There have been freezes in places like Florida and California. There's a supply chain issue. Some of this should sound familiar. So there are some major supply chain issues, and inflation has taxed limited household budgets. Wages are not able to keep pace with rising prices. The prices of some commodities quadrupled. And of course, European agriculture is in shambles. As other nations bought American foodstuffs, they increased the demand. And of course, the supply and demand will increase prices. We also have war speculation. War speculators will increase and manipulate the supply as well. Samuel Gompers, the president of the American Federation of Labor, was quoted as saying as calling these speculators, they were food pirates who were trying to buy up crops before the plants are out of the ground. Speculators gamble on human needs. By creating human want, these ghouls expect to coin enormous profits. How bad is this? How bad is it to have a riot? In 1916, supper alone cost 76 cents per meal or $22 a month. The average wage was about $40 a month and rent averaged about $15 or so. A year later, in 1917, retail prices, as I mentioned, have risen across the board to about 32% is what we're looking at when we're looking at numbers here. This is about $1.99 a meal or $59 a month. Reminder that your average wage is $40 a month. One Washington, D.C. housewife noted that her family had been living on oatmeal, bread, and coffee for 2 months. Sorry, trying to advance my slide, and there we go. These riots, of course, as usually happens, these riots do really nothing to decrease the cost of food. In April of 1917, food costs continued to rise and increased upwards of about 39%. Sorry, I'm out of practice. I'll get it. The Clinch Valley News in Tazewell, Virginia reported that the average family was spending about $425.57 annually, considerably less than elsewhere, but just barely under the yearly average salary, again, of $480. When the United States entered the war in April of 1917, the New York Times posed the question, how are we to feed our allies across the water and have enough to feed ourselves? The crops of 1917 will decide whether the world shall be fed or starve in 1918. Editors also warned, for every man who must shoulder a rifle for military duty, we had better be able to furnish inducement for another to take up farm work. The issue that we have here is that this increase in new war work, there are better wages, better benefits. You know, if you go and work in a munitions plant, or you go and work in a factory of sorts, pays much better than farm labor does. And this will pull already scarce farm workers from the fields. Woodrow Wilson, then in response to this, will initially declare that farm workers will be exempt from the draft. But this idea will be nixed in August, and doesn't matter where you work, farm or not, men will be called up for the draft. There are other ideas. A great agricultural army using prisoners of war, but considering the fact that it's April of 1917, I don't know where Americans are going to get prisoners of war from quite yet. It's going to be a little while before Americans will go over there. So that's going to take a while too. But as Washington vacillated, the Richmond Times Dispatch claimed that short rations would soon become a society fad. So, tighten those belts, folks. It's going to become worse. In August of 1917, the Food and Fuel Control Act was passed, and this creates the Food Administration. Herbert Hoover, who had been directing supply and relief efforts in war-torn Belgium, was called in to be the director of the new Food Administration. Herbert Hoover gets kind of a bad rap for the Great Depression, and I kind of don't blame folks there for that. But I am a big fan of logistics. I love the idea of how do you get things from one place to another. And if Herbert Hoover is a genius at logistics, and he's very, very good at organization. So there's one place where he does succeed, and it does happen to be with this food conservation, with this kind of food administration effort. And if you don't believe me, I'll get to that in just a minute. How do we remember? There are things that we actually have kind of passed down within our American memory that have come out of Hoover's food administration. That's a tongue twister. Don't try to say that 10 times real fast. So on September 29th, 1917, Hoover called on all Americans to aid the war effort with this "food will win the war." And he set out to find ways to encourage and to promote production and food conservation. We'll see then the Food Administration will set up things like home and school gardens. They will set up canneries. You'll see in some places, you'll see community canneries will be set up. Some of these canneries still exist. There is a community cannery, for example, in the Shenandoah Valley. I believe it was set up under the Food Administration. You also see things like Meatless Mondays and Wheatless Wednesdays. Wheatless Wednesday isn't quite as popular anymore, but most of us have definitely heard of Meatless Mondays. We also have, this great Food Administration poster, "The greatest crime in Christendom, of course, to buy, to cook, to eat more than what you need. Don't waste food. There are starving children in Europe." Later in my generation, it becomes "there are starving children in Africa." But this idea kind of gets passed down from generation to generation, and it begins with Hoover's Food Administration. So again, while the federal administration is trying to get things going, we do see a variety of states and private organizations jumping in with both feet. Even before the United States entered the war, the state of South Carolina had set up a commission on agriculture, as does Indiana, Michigan, Massachusetts, New York. We'll also see private organizations like the Red Cross, the YWCA, the Women's Trade Union League, the Daughters of the American Revolution will also set up a few organizations to try to promote this. We will also see organizations like the Girl Scouts. These next two photos are actually, while they're labeled as farmerettes, they actually exist before the actual farmerette group is an organization. I believe these are Girl Scouts. They are picking peaches. It's what's now Blue Mountain Orchard, or was Blue Mountain Orchard, which is in Loudoun, was in Loudoun County, Virginia. So those of you who are familiar with Loudoun County, it's now a lot of suburbs, not as many farms as there once were, but these young ladies were preparing to, and then were packing peaches at Blue Mountain Orchards in Loudoun County, Virginia. I don't believe the farm is still in existence. I looked, I didn't see it. So Google Maps is a glorious thing. So here they are again. Again, this is August 1917. Our Women's Land Army of America does not yet exist, but we see the mobilization happening and kind of the beginnings of this. We do, however, we see in the fall of 1917, an assistant secretary of the Department of Agriculture traveled to New York from Washington, D.C. to investigate this phenomenon of women working in the fields. His agricultural department colleagues were dismissive, but Carl Schurzvrumen was very curious. And he was impressed by the women that he encountered in New York, in Bedford, New York, and he likened them to the Russian Battalion of Death, calling them a credit to yourself, to your sex, and to your country. The labor situation, again, is still not there. Men are being called up for the draft, and just before Christmas in 1917, at the Hotel Astor in New York, the Women's Land Army of America was born. The delegates that were at this meeting some of them were veterans of the budding land service movement from the Girl Scouts, from the DAR, from the YWCA. Some were newcomers from groups who saw this type of war work as a complement to their missions. Some were from the Federal Food Administration, the state women's committees, and Employment Bureau officials. The final speaker was a Helen Fraser. She's from Great Britain, and she lauded the efforts of the English Women's Land Army, who again were also, like the American Women's Land Army, were very slow to start out. But by 1916, 1917, were very much were incredibly productive in England. And delegates here at the Hotel Astor agreed that the pear was ripe, pun intended. To honor those laboring across the ocean, they would create the Women's Land Army of America. Slight note here, the English Women's Land Army is English Women's Land Army, WOMEN''S. In the United States, it's woman's, WOMAN''S. There's my English teacherness coming out on me here. They are two different, they are a very similar organization, and I get very excited when I see something labeled Women's Land Army of America, only to find out it's Britain and it's just been spelled wrong. Little factoid of the day. I meant to have this slide earlier, I'm sorry. These were our Barnard farmerettes from the Women's Agriculture Unit in Bedford. This was one of the first kind of college groups that was begun, and this is the group that Carl Schurz Vrooman from the Department of Agriculture visited and called basically the Russian Battalion of Death. So now the Women's Land Army exists on paper, but putting, as we all know, putting something into practice is completely different. So these women, and then the Women's Land Army of America, then they ask for money from cooperating groups and from sympathetic supporters. They requested agricultural colleges to provide short training courses to convince farmers to hire female laborers. They also put in a special request to women's colleges to substitute gardening classes for gym requirements and to give credit for spring Land Army service. Within a few weeks into 1918, there were Women's Land Army chairmen appointed in 15 states, and by the mid-1918, this will have expanded to 39 states. This includes, of course, Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. We also will see a Women's Land Army here in North Carolina. They're a little bit more difficult to trace, struggling a little with that one, but it will happen slowly but surely in my spare time. There is opposition in these areas. For example, the Maryland Women's Committee on Food Production circulated a questionnaire to farmers to gauge their sentiment on allowing Women's Land Army workers to work on farms, and the results were not positive. Farmers fully expected and were undergoing a labor shortage, but they were not at all eager to employ untrained women workers. In one county in Maryland, they did express the desire. They said that African-American female labor was acceptable, but white female labor was not. This was not the solution that state authorities had in mind. Maryland suggested things like in Frederick County, the Farm Vacation Club, where city folks would spend their summer vacation on a farm doing the heavy labor. And this was for men and boys. No, women weren't allowed into this farm vacation club, but you could spend 2 weeks working on a farm. I'm sure you maybe, if any of you have experience with farming, that many farmers were very reluctant to use anyone from the cities who did not have any experience whatsoever. On March 26th, 1918, the Washington Times took on a very serious tone. In Washington, 16 women had already volunteered to be trouseretted farmerettes, including the 3 daughters of the chairwoman of the Women's Committee of the Food Production Committee of the District Council of National Defense. Before I wrote that down, I had to double check to make sure that that was the whole title, and that was the whole title. It's a very long title. And again, this is Mrs. Ransom and her daughters. These are the types of women who were joining this. The article made sure to note that the girls would be housed, by the way, on 2 farms, that of Dr. Willie Moore of Rockville, Maryland, and Mrs. J.W. Eccles of Vienna, Fairfax County, Virginia. Also, all workers would be under supervision, as the work was considered a very serious matter, one of patriotic duty and national importance, and anything that would detract from the health or the efficiency of the farmerettes was strictly taboo. The article finished saying that frivolity or lack of appreciation for the seriousness of the work would be a grave offense. One of the things that these women are going to have to overcome is the frivolity that was kind of, I don't say it was given to them, but that started the idea of frivolity that kind of was part of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont's 1911 failed farm campaign. She opened a farm for young society women, and it was lampooned in the press. This is where the term farmerette comes from. It is a term where you take suffragette and farmerette and put them together, and it's really meant to be a demeaning term, but much like the term suffragette instead of suffragist, the term farmerette was kind of embraced and said, yes, we were able to do this as well. So this is going to be this is a very hard sell for a lot of people. There's this idea that these young society women will not be able to compete. They will not be able, or any women will not be able to compete or do this type of heavy labor. The Times also stressed, by the way, the refinement of these farmerettes in the Chronicles of Capital Society Doings. You go into the society pages, and this is actually where I found a lot of information on farmerettes, or in the society pages. For example, I love the tone that's kind of brought into this newspaper, this article here. One camp is already in operation in Silesia, Maryland. And who do you suppose is chaperoning the girls down there right now? General Mordecai's daughter, Mrs. J.D. Miley, Amy Brooks, and Margaret Dennis are hard at work at Silesia now, and Dorothy Bertholf expects to join them there shortly. So again, this idea of kind of promotion, that these are better members of society who are doing this work. They are hopefully will have less, will have need less supervision. Despite the initial misgivings, when farmers did hire these young ladies, by August of 1918, this verdict is in. The women were getting rave reviews. In August 21st, 1918, the Washington Herald said that the general testimony of farmers employing women labor is that experience proves that what they lack in physical strength, they more than make up in their superior conscientiousness and quickness. Their clothing, however, is still up for debate. Most women were encouraged, and there is a uniform that's worn by these young ladies and sometimes older ladies. There is a uniform that's worn. They are trouseretted farmerettes. Bifurcated garb is another one of my favorite descriptions of what they're wearing. They are encouraged to wear bloomers or pants, as it were. Sometimes we'll see images of women wearing overalls. On the 6th of June, 1918, the Richmond Times-Dispatch publishes a little blurb that says, "I once loved a maid, and my love was warm. Upon her I showered gifts and goods galore, but I've seen her in her farmerette uniform, and I do not love her anymore." Yeah, this idea of women wearing pants was quite scandalous. And in fact, in some more southern areas, South Carolina, North Carolina, for example, women were not encouraged to wear, they were encouraged to wear skirts and not this bifurcated garb. It was distracting, it was shocking. How dare they wear pants? Shock and horror. as we see here, we still continue to see there, and there's our women wearing trousers. They're wearing overalls. Men's absolutely wearing men's overalls, right? It is one thing, women were considered too fragile for heavy labor. Most of the time, women are doing things like they're berry picking, they are picking in orchards. It's not super heavy labor. They aren't driving horses, they aren't driving plows, they aren't mending fences. Girls laboring on farms, however, they really chafed at simply weeding radishes and hoeing rows, and they really longed to be put to work on heavier tasks like hayricking. One of the things that we see too, again, the general testimony of farmers who employed these women was that they needed little daily supervision. Sorry, let me say that again. They needed little daily supervision. Farmers in Campbell County, Virginia, claimed that the farmerettes from Randolph-Macon Women's College had made good. One of the things too, the ideas of promoting this to farmers, they seem to thoroughly enjoy their farm experience. For example, Esther Forbes. I'm not sure if many of you have read the book Johnny Tremain. It was a book I grew up on. It was one of my favorite books as a child. Esther Forbes wrote, among other things, Johnny Tremain, but I recently, well, a couple of years ago, a friend discovered that Esther Forbes had been a member of the Women's Land Army of America. And when she was involved in 1941, she was involved at urging the reorganization of farmerettes to solve the labor shortage that had begun developing during World War II. And Forbes' story is kind of typical of all of these women. She served on a 500-acre farm near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. The Worcester Evening Telegraph refers to this as Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which it is decidedly not. And the name of this farm is Media, and she served with the daughter, for example, of the U.S. ambassador to Britain. And even before the beginning of the war, the farmers, the forward thinkingness of the farmers who owned Media, John Yates and William and Marshall McDonald, they had been discussing employing students from the University of Wisconsin to assist with their farm work. The brothers constructed several small tenant houses, and the farm then was run almost entirely by inexperienced farmerettes between 1917 and 1919. These young women, who were students from all around the country, quickly learned life on a farm, such as cutting corn and wheat, picking and packing apples, driving horses, mending fences, painting roofs, and Forbes herself was one of those rare teamsters, and she drove horses. She noted that one of the best workers was a petite 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed only 100 pounds. And she also says that, quote, one of the most robust, looked extremely healthy, but couldn't endure some of the most strenuous duties. So again, even her own perception of these women that she was working with has changed. A very tiny woman who's able to do everything, and the larger one who just cannot endure, as she says, the most strenuous duties. We also will see slightly to the southwest, the state commissioner, Virginia State Commissioner S.L. Lupton was owner of one of the largest apple orchards in Virginia at 267 acres. He too employed farmerettes to harvest and ship his fruit crop. We know that girls from Winchester had picked apples for 2 seasons. The last season they picked with soldiers who were no longer needed, quote, over there. So we're seeing women then slowly but surely kind of earning the trust of a variety of farmers. Virginia is slightly behind Maryland in their mobilization, but we do see women from places like Randolph-Macon Women's College. These women had been engaged in what they were considered intensive farming. They worked an average of about 8 hours a day. And again, farmers were incredibly pleased by what they had been doing. We also see 2 groups, not just from colleges, but another Women's Land Army group had been recruited from Foxcroft School in Middleburg, Virginia. Oh, I apologize for I don't know what happened to my slide. Hopefully this will, hopefully this will read a little better here. Um, Later that year, so later in 1918, Edith Deal was in charge of organizing training camps. She hatched a plan to bring more Southern states into the WLA fold. The National Field Secretary was Olga Ilsing, and she journeyed by train through the South in 1918. And she said, as far as the land army is concerned, Mississippi is barren soil. Then I went to Alabama and received still less encouragement. In South Carolina, she was given a little bit of advice. We would be better off to stay at home to raise families. However, the governor of South Carolina, she found to be land army friendly. Deal's plan to draw in more states included a national training center in Charlottesville on the grounds of the university there. And we do begin to see then this being moved in so Virginia really began kind of honing in on its Women's Land Army in March of 1919. Olga Ilsing visited Roanoke on the 6th of March to start a group in that city. And an article in the World News noted that of the 15,000 members the previous year, 200 had been Virginians. Organizers hoped to enroll a much larger number. To entice enrollees, scholarships were offered to deserving girls by prominent Virginia women, including the governor's wife. There was a charge to attend these Women's Land Army training camps. So again, this is going to exclude a number of women. It's going to exclude poorer women. It will also most likely, it will exclude African-American women as well. But by June 1st, 1919, the Richmond Times-Dispatch claimed that a number of Richmonders had applied for admission to the training camp at UVA, making sure to note the luxuries afforded the attendees: electric lights and shower baths, a recreation center. Edith Deal had expected about 600 students to enroll during the summer 6 semesters and spent several weeks trying to save the camp, but it closed by mid-July. We will also see so I went to the University of Virginia a couple of years ago to look into their archives, and was kind of disappointed by the fact that I didn't find a lot of information pertaining to UVA's involvement with this. Perhaps I was just looking in the wrong place. If anybody has any clues, a little bit more what to find, how UVA was involved in this, I'd be forever grateful. Special collections librarians, of course, are wonderful people, but I love them. There's only two folders, and they were tiny little folders. I was kind of disappointed. So hopefully I'll be able to find more at some other time. Moving up to DC just a wee bit. By the end of by April 23rd, 1919, Washington, DC had set aside 10 acres as a training field and commercial garden. I even instructed girls, women, how to take public transit to get off on the corner here of McDonald and Blair Road. This Legacy Memorial Park, it's now a cemetery. What was the 10 acres with the training camp outside of Washington, D.C. now has become a cemetery, but originally in 1919, this was a Women's Land Army training facility. You notice that, very slowly, it seems that Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C., North Carolina, these are all very kind of slow starters here. And you also notice that I've moved into 1919. As most of us are aware, World War I is over November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m. And so the question becomes, why are we still hiring women workers in the spring, in the summer of 1919, as men are slowly beginning to trickle back from overseas? And this becomes a problem. And in fact, by the end of July 1919, the wealthy women who had subsidized the Women's Land Army moved on. They moved on to other things. They began to put their money into things like prohibition. They also began to put their money and their efforts into women's suffrage. States continued to need labor through the fall harvest. As I mentioned earlier, we do have in Winchester a group of farmerettes picking and packing apples with a group of soldiers who are no longer needed overseas. But most Women's Land Army divisions, once the money dries up, so do the Women's Land Army divisions. On September 26th, 1919, a special meeting of the National Board voted to voluntarily dissolve the Women's Land Army of America. There's no formal ceremony marking its end, unlike its British counterpart. But the thing is the idea behind the Women's Land Army is not dead. As mentioned before, as I mentioned earlier, Esther Forbes in 1941, she is attempting to, she's getting involved in reviving the Women's Land Army. She's, giving this call, and so are the other 20 to 40,000 women who will join the Women's Land Army in World War I. They will serve as a reminder for their daughters and their granddaughters in the next generations. And then the Women's Land Army will be reinstituted in 1943. This is a great image too, again, from the Library of Congress of the two types of uniforms seen in both World War I and World War II. I still have yet to see an original Land Army uniform. If anybody finds one, please let me know. I'd love that as well. So I am finished, I think. Yes. Oh, that was great timing. So it was perfect. So questions. I would love to answer questions. Let me back out of my screen share here. And the question was, is there a list? No. Part of the issue is, as I mentioned too, that it is a national organization, but yet it's so much more state driven. And we also see too these farmerette programs at places, at colleges. So sometimes colleges would have kept a record of these girls, women who took these classes. For example, what's the State Normal School here in North Carolina, which is now the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. They have a program. They have wonderful photos in their archives. We do have some names, but I don't think we have all of them. It is really a puzzle that I'm slowly putting together. I'm building on the work of others who have kind of looked at these larger programs and California and New York and doing that. But it's really hard to find, like, yes, so I found these 200 women from Virginia. I don't know their names. I'm hoping that maybe some days when I'll give one of these talks and somebody will come to me and say, my grandmother used to talk about, or my great grandmother used to talk about this. And I'll be like, oh my gosh, tell me more. So kind of hoping that at some point that will happen. It hasn't yet, but you never know.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned you haven't seen a uniform. Does that mean there are none in any museum or anything like that at all?
Not that I know of. Now, that doesn't mean that a historical society doesn't, in, I don't know, Wisconsin, doesn't have one. I've seen pictures of them. There are definitely photographs of women wearing them. There are pictures. I've never seen a full-on, this is a full-on farmerette uniform image. In fact, the photo on that last slide, that's a khaki colored uniform. But what's interesting is in the official records, the uniform should be blue and not khaki. So I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes the official records and what actually happens are not
right. Or that particular woman's unit just decided they wanted to do khaki colored instead of blue. And that's the other issue that we have too, is that in some of the more southern units, for example, if you look at the girls from State Normal School, University of North Carolina, Greensboro, when you look at them, they're all wearing skirts. And they were very specifically said they shouldn't wear skirts because they didn't want to restrict your muscles. But wearing pants in 1919 was a really big deal. Like, you just didn't wear pants. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the suffragists were like, we're wearing skirts above our ankles and not.
Right. Yeah. So the question is talking about, it was asking about that women were seen as unskilled laborers, and was farm work a skilled thing? Um, that's actually a really good question. There are, and I'm going on this from growing up, having done some types of farm work. There are certain things that are skilled. Driving a team of horses and plowing with a team of horses is definitely skilled labor. It is not something I can do. It's not something that is, you can't just put somebody on, behind a team of 4 or 6 horses or mules and just allow them to go.
Go for it.
Right? Yeah, go ahead. Just see what happens. No, that is not really something. I don't think farmers were not willing to risk that equipment. And tractors, if a farmer did own a tractor, it was an incredibly expensive piece of equipment. And they were very few and far between. So there are some types of farming that is very skilled. And then there's some types of farming, picking peaches, apples, whatever. Anybody can come in and, well, almost anybody can come in and pick apples. So there's a difference. You don't want somebody who's never worked with a team of horses before trying to plow your 50-acre field.
Right.
It's not something you want to do. So that is going to be kind of a hang up too. And as I said, Esther Forbes is a teamster. She has learned how to drive those horses. I've seen images of women sitting on a plow behind, a team of 4 or 6 horses, big draft horses. I'm like, God, that's incredible.
Now, how did you get started on this research journey? What was the spark?
So as part of my love of public history and World War I, I had for a while, I had a Army Nurse Corps impression. So Army Nurse Corps from World War I was, it wasn't really like, it just didn't really catch me. It wasn't something I was really excited about. And so I do a timeline event every year at Fort Dobbs State Historic Site in Statesville, North Carolina, and it's usually around Veterans Day weekend. And so of course, it's a military timeline looking at how people served in North Carolina. From we've had folks come in from 1588 doing Roanoke and then go all the way up to modern day. So I would come down and I would talk about the Army Nurse Corps. It just wasn't exciting. That wasn't exciting to me. But again, I grew up in West Virginia. I grew up in farm country in West Virginia. I grew up not far from a lot of these places. Winchester that's where I used to go to Winchester a lot growing up. And I was doing some research and looking at something, and so somebody mentioned Women's Land Army of America, and I was like, what is this? This is fascinating. And so I picked up Elaine Weiss's book called Fruits of Victory and read that and just was like, this is fascinating. And I want to learn more, and I want to know more about the women here. I want to know more about women in this section. Her book, it covers California, larger groups, California, New Mexico, New York. But I was like, well, what about Maryland? What about Virginia? And so North Carolina. And so that's kind of how that rabbit hole began. And that rabbit hole has continued. So here we are.
Have you thought about making that a character that you portray?
Well, I do when I do stuff at Fort Dobbs or do the timeline event. I do have I have a uniform. I have original patterns, and I've made bloomers, which are so comfortable. They're super comfortable.
The pockets in some of those pictures, I was like, look at those pockets. I love those.
Right, and they're big, and you can do so much work in bloomers. It's amazing. And they're pretty unattractive looking, but really they're super comfortable, so who cares? But I have I've put together the entire kit. I do have I have, like I said, I have bloomers. I have original boots, which are beautiful. but so I do have the impressions. So I have gone, like I said, gone when I do go to Fort Dobbs in November. I talk about the farmerettes there, and I've been trying to get members of this is I don't know if anybody's listening there, maybe they'll listen later, but there's a group that does the British Women's Land Army and World War II. Jenny and Emma and Angela, if you're listening, we could do World War One. So they do the British Land Army and World War II at Military Through the Ages at Jamestown. So I've been trying to kind of convince them to go a little earlier and do America with me.
Do you know if there's any connection between the farmerettes and then what later became the suffrage movement, because they were kind of transitioned into the next thing?
Absolutely. There is a huge connection. You see a lot of those. In fact, Alva Belmont and Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Harriet Stanton Blatch is a huge mover and shaker in the Food Administration. I don't remember what her exact title is, but yes, there's this amazing connection between those women with the suffrage movement and the farmerette movement. They really felt that in many cases that by showing that women could do it too, that they could, kind of like almost like Rosie the Riveter, we can do it. It's almost like that, but hey, we can do this too. So if we can do this job and we can do these jobs in World War I, then certainly we should be able to earn the vote too. So that is one of the issues that we will see, that when the war is over, we see this kind of push, that money really going to fund suffrage, because they're so close to suffrage by 1919, if not almost there. I think Tennessee votes in 1919. So.
And we did have a comment in the chat. A great book on the topic is by Amy Stewart, which is a whole series called Cop Sisters on the March. Have you heard of that? And she says there's some good resources on Amy Stewart's website. So don't know if we've tracked down a uniform for you yet, but.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions either in the chat or in the Q&A? I think we have answered them all.
Hi, Lauren. I recognize Lauren. I recognize your name. Yes, Agricultural History Farm Park. They're out of Rockville, Maryland, and they have done some farmerette programs too. So.
Oh, cool. Okay, well, I think that wraps up our program. Oh, do you have a book?
No, I don't.
Will you have a book?
People always ask me, my mom is always like, you should write a book. And I'm like, no.
I like reading books. Why would I write a book?
I don't like writing. I love researching and I love talking and I love presenting information, but gosh, do I hate writing. Like that was like the worst part of like my master's degree was the writing the thesis part. But people keep saying, oh, you should publish. And one of these days, but my full-time job is teaching, and it is a full-time and a half job most of the time. So maybe someday.
Do you have a website, an Instagram, a TikTok page?
No. I guess maybe I should do those things. We do have, my 18th century group, we do have we have a page, a full Civilian Contingent page. That's a public page. Really, this is something that when we're in the years leading up to the centennial, I did a lot of these talks when I was still living in Virginia, up in the northern, especially northern Virginia. I did a lot of these talks, and I had people ask me the same thing. And then I moved to North Carolina, and everything kind of fell by the wayside. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you think the information is great. That's wonderful. Thank you. I guess maybe this is one of those things that I should really consider putting together. So that's kind of nice to have some feedback that people are interested in this. Like for me, this is one of my like rabbit holes, and I'm fascinated by it. And just because I'm fascinated by it doesn't mean other people are. You know, that's usually how that goes. People are like, oh my God, that's so boring. But yeah, you know, now that I do see some folks who are interested, you know, I mean, I'd be happy maybe if Lauren, if you're still there, maybe that's something that we could collaborate on. This is something I know that you have done research on as well, and that might be something that will help kind of promote your museum too. So yeah, so I think, Lauren, I think if you and I connect, that may be something, like I said, if people are interested in, then I could help get more information on your museum too. I'm a big fan of museum promotion, as you could tell. Port Jobs State Historic Site. Sorry, but yeah. So yeah, I definitely will. Now that I do have kind of a broader platform and people seem to be more interested, maybe there's some ways of getting that information out there for you folks. So
yeah, seems very timely.
Yes,
considering what we're kind of seeing the world become. So people would probably be very interested in seeing how that's problem was solved 100 years ago.
I think there was a point where I was like, does any of this sound familiar to you? Inflation, you know, supply chain issues.
Supply chain issues. Yep. Nothing new under the sun.
And Lauren in the chat has put some things in, like ALFAM, which is the American Living History and Farm. There's a lot of great stuff with them too. So I love museums. That's what I started doing before I became a teacher. So I love public history. I love museums. And so I'll promote them as much as I can too. So.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. We appreciate this. And thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you'll consider joining us for our next Tuesday talk. We have one every month. And that information is available either on Facebook or our website. So thank you all for taking the time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.